We're talking today with Dr. Steve Wiegenstein, author of Slant of Light, a novel set in the southeast Missouri Ozarks during the Civil War era.
Slant of Light starts in the late 1850s with the arrival of a group of what could loosely be called utopian colonists to the Ozarks. My idea was to place a group of kind of idealistic people down into a river valley in the Ozarks near where I grew up, and then to kind of let events play out and see what happens with them. Of course, in the late 1850s, it gets harder and harder to live an ideal way of life as the war gets closer and finally breaks out, and the novel takes place into the first couple of years of the Civil War in the Ozarks.
The utopian community in the book is called Daybreak, and I know we had various utopian communities in Illinois and Missouri in that era. Is it modeled after any particular utopian community that you studied?
Yes, in a loose sort of way. Throughout my teaching life, I was always interested in this group that was called the Icarians. And the Icarians were a French community who lived in various places. I've always been really interested by that particular bunch because of the kinds of struggles they went through. So I modeled the Daybreak community on them with a lot of changes, of course, because, for example, the Icarians were mostly French-speaking. They were an immigrant group, where for the Daybreak group I made them homegrown.
In Slant of Light, James Turner is a charismatic personality who founds Daybreak, and he attracts his followers to live there. In your study of utopian communities, is there generally a charismatic leader like that is the center of the community?
There is almost always. There's almost always somebody who's got the big idea, you know, and some person with the big idea who attracts people, you know, by some sort of magnetic force of personality. I grew up in Fredericktown up to the age of 10, and my dad was a mechanic for the implement dealer there, an international harvester dealer whose name was Peppercorn. And he used to take us kids, me and my brother, along with him whenever he could, when he would make a repair run on somebody's hay baler or combine or whatnot. And so we got to know the area around Madison County pretty well just as youngsters. And I was always entranced by the area right there along the St. Francis River, where it's really steep and rugged. The mountains come right down to the river, and the river gets, you know, very dramatic looking. And for some reason, that part of the county always seemed filled with beauty and mystery to me. And here it is, decades later, and I was trying to think of a good setting for this novel, and for some reason that came back to me. And I remember that landscape as if I had grown up on it just yesterday. And so it was really kind of like revisiting some of my old haunts to put a book.
What was your research like to help you capture those emotions and the flavor of that time?
Well, there's a couple of sources. One is just our own family history, and I think if anybody grew up in Missouri and has family roots to go back there, you probably have heard some of those kinds of stories yourself about neighbor turning against neighbor, you know, family members turning against family members, things like that. There's also just a wonderful book. It's called Missouri's Civil War. It's a collection of original documents, speeches, letters, legislation, and things like that, that if you want to get a kind of in-deep sort of flavor of attitudes of the time, I would recommend very highly. It's an excellent book, and really kind of brings out the peculiar situation of Missouri.
When you were writing this, did the news coverage of the civil wars going on around the world? Did that inform or influence your writing?
Oddly enough, it did, and I'm grateful that you picked up on that. The idea for this book happened to me in 2007. Is when I first started sketching ideas, and of course that was the time when the situation in Iraq was so chaotic, and I remember I was reading a bit about the history of Missouri during the Civil War, and the analogy to Iraq 2007 was just so striking to me that it really did influence my thinking, in that you had an army, an invading army, which was seen by the local folks as occupiers, despite their good motives, and that's the way that the American forces were seen, as whether you liked them or didn't like them, they were an occupying force. You had the civilian population being used as pawns in the conflict, and that's one of the things that I think people who read the history of Missouri during the war are so struck by sometimes, is just how devastating it was to the civilians.
You portray Sam Hildebrand as a good-humored and gentlemanly person, but still a ruthless killer. And he's certainly a well-known figure to many people in southeast Missouri. Did you take any artistic license with his character, or did you base him strictly on research?
Well, I took some license in that just to fit the timeline of the book, I had to move his guerrilla activities up a little bit. I had to get him started doing guerrilla work before he really did. So there's not a clean timeline in the real Sam Hildebrand and the fictional one. But I felt like I tried to really capture his personality. But Hildebrand, like everybody else, is a complicated guy, and I had a lot of. It was very rewarding for me to work with that real historical figure and try to communicate what a person would have been like during that era.
Well, I thought I could.
Certainly here in Missouri we have a big tradition of these kind of outlaw folk heroes like Jesse James, and Hildebrand, and Bloody Bill, and those kinds of characters. And part of it, I think, is good press. They get portrayed sympathetically in either newspapers or dime novels, and so that sort of creates this image. And of course, some of them actually actively manipulated their press. Also, certain of these characters kind of have an appeal that speaks to sympathy with the outsider against the establishment, particularly if the establishment, as in the case of all three of these characters, was at fault in some ways.
The publisher on this book is Blank Slate Press in St. Louis. Could you talk to us a little bit about Blank Slate Press?
Blank Slate Press is one of several small publishers here in Missouri. And the big publishing industry, the New York publishing industry, is really in turmoil and disarray these days. But underneath that, there's a real flourishing of small presses, Blank Slate being one of those that are regional in nature, or they're very focused in what they like to publish. And these folks they're a very small press, but they absolutely just love books.
What do you envision for the Daybreak series?
Well, the second book is done, and it should be coming out late 2013, early 2014, soon to see how the schedule goes. It starts in 1865 with the end of the war and the return of the survivors to Daybreak. So I'm working on the third book. It takes place in 1888, or it starts in 1888, and the children of the first two novels are the main characters. And, I've got it mapped out in my mind anyway. So let's just hope that I can see it through to the end.